Today, we're going to cover some security considerations in Next.js. And to do that, we're going to actually look at an article from Next.js. This comes from nextjs.org, as you can see here at the top of my page here. And this article, I'll make sure to link it in the description box below. If I forget, definitely let me know that I'll link it in the description box below. But this is called How to Think About Security in Next.js from Sebastian here. So we're going to cover this article, and I'm going to give you some of my own kind of opinions and my own kind of understandings, elaborations on some of the things mentioned in this article, because I think there's some stuff mentioned in this article that I hadn't really thought about that I think are actually really good to think about. And I think that if you're kind of getting into Next.js, there's going to be a lot of stuff here that are important to consider, especially when attempting to build some applications that might be more for production applications, that security considerations might become even more important compared to maybe just building out like a demo project to learn some different things about Next.js. So first off, it talks about choosing your data handling model. So let me zoom into this a little bit more here. And it discusses how rack server components blur the line between server and client. Data handling is paramount to understanding where information is processed and where it's made available. So it kind of goes over 3 different ways of handling data within your application, and also gives different recommendations for certain types of projects and what might be the best way for you to handle data within your project. So first, it covers an HTTP API. So this is basically like having an API layer for your project to where anytime in your Next.js app, if you want to get some data from your server or from your database, you'll use an API layer. So in your server components, you'd be basically still making fetch requests to an API, and then your kind of API layer will then communicate with your database. So you have your application code in Next.js, and then you have this API layer here, and then on the other side of that would be your database. So your Next.js code communicates with kind of your API layer. Your API layer communicates with your database. And this API layer is where you're going to write some of your kind of permissions and authorization and security best practices to then go get data from your database or write data to your database, or kind of some more sensitive stuff that you don't or might not want to necessarily just give access from your application code. You might want that layer in between. So this is what we're talking about when we say HTTP APIs. And here it says, if you're adopting server components in an existing project, so you already have a project kind of underway, maybe it was prior to App Router, and now you're kind of migrating over to server components, then you might use this approach, in which basically it says that they recommend to handle server components at runtime as unsafe or untrusted by default, just like server-side rendering or client components. So there's no assumption of internal network or zones or of trust, and engineers can apply the concept of zero trust. Instead, you only call custom API endpoints such as REST or GraphQL using fetch from server components, just like you would if you're executing that code on the client. So just like what I kind of mentioned, even if you're using a server component, you would still basically make a request to your API layer, and you would let your API layer handle all that communication to your database. And here they go to mention that this approach allows you to keep existing organizational structures for existing backend teams that might specialize in security or API handling and stuff like that, to still use those best practices. And they say it might work particularly well if those other teams use something like Python or something that's not JavaScript to kind of still have that layer that can be written in that different language. So this is that it still takes advantage of a lot of the benefits of server components by sending less code to the client, but you don't run into the issues of, maybe you already have this API layer, which you probably would if you just had like a client-side Next.js application. Maybe you still have this API layer, but you still get some of the benefits of using server components, but you still kind of treat them, at least when it comes to data handling, as kind of zero trust, similar to how you would treat client components. Now, if you're starting a Next.js project from scratch, they recommend using a data access layer. So basically, instead of using this HTTP layer in which you'll make fetch requests in your server components and kind of have a intermediate layer to then communicate with your database, you'd instead create like a JavaScript module in your application. So it might be a data module. And this module is kind of like a data access layer that allows you to then import those functions into your server components to effectively kind of directly access your database. But since you have this data access layer, you're still putting a lot of kind of measures in place to make sure that you're still following some security best practices here. So it goes on to say here that the data access layer inside your JavaScript code base and consolidate all data access there. This approach ensures consistent data access and reduces the chance of authorization bugs occurring. It's also easier to maintain given everything is in one library, possibly providing better team cohesion. And then below it says you build an internal JavaScript library that provides custom data access checks before giving it to the caller. So basically, this kind of data library that you would have, it's going to perform checks like, do you have an authenticated user? Does this authenticated user have permissions to access this particular piece of data within your database? Does it have access to write to this piece of data? Does it have access to update this piece of data? So on and so forth. So rather than having this HTTP layer, you have this data module in which you perform these checks, and then you can let your server components just consume these functions and use these functions to where your server components can then just call these functions and use that data. So you don't really have this HTTP layer to where it's making a fetch request or something like that. It's just using these functions provided from this library here. So as an example of what this might look like, in a data folder here, you might have an auth.ts or JS file. And this is basically where you get the current user and you return whether this is like an authenticated user or not. And then you might have other files within that data module in which maybe you want to get a profile of the user. So you want to be able to get like their phone number and their email and different things like that. Well, in this get profile function, well, you might get the current user using get current user from this file right here, which is going to get the current like authenticated user. And then you're also going to do some checks. Okay, and this user, are they allowed to see their username? Well, here it's saying it's just public info for now, so this function just returns true. But in the future, you might kind of do some different things to where only users with these certain credentials can actually look at the username. So you might add some custom logic here. And then here, they have a can see phone number. So the privacy rules for seeing a phone number is they must be an is admin, and the team must be equal to the viewer.team. So here in this function, they get the current user, and then they only return the username and phone number. If the can see username is true, then they will return the user data.username. And they'll also check can see phone number. If that's true, then they will return the phone number. So this data access layer, then you could go ahead and use this get profile DTO function within your server components. You can call this function directly, but since you put these kind of security measures in place of getting the current authenticated user, doing these checks for seeing a username, seeing a phone number, you already know that those security credentials are in place. So your server component can just consume this function without really needing to worry about some of these kind of security credentials here. So it says here, these methods should expose objects that are safe to be transferred to the client as is. We like to call these data transfer objects, DTO, to clarify that they're ready to be consumed by the client. They might only get consumed by server components in practice. This creates a layering where security audits can primarily focus on the data access layer while the UI can rapidly iterate. So This allows you to, in your server components, you can just focus on generating your UI or your different components and not really have to worry about accessing data from your database. And then if you notice that there might be some potential security vulnerabilities in your application regarding data access, you know exactly where to check. You don't have to go through all of your server components to check that. You just check your data access layer and that should handle things for you. So this is the preferred approach in building your new applications. Now, you can also take a component level data access, and I've actually done this several times in just building out different mock applications to teach you guys stuff, because we're kind of just iterating fast, prototyping quickly. But I think in the future, I will use more of this kind of like data access approach for future projects. But another approach is just to put your database queries directly into your server component. So this would be component level data access. And this approach is only appropriate for rapid iteration and prototyping, similar to what I do in my tutorials. But I think one thing that I can do better is being more clear about, we're doing this for the sake of a tutorial to learn different things, not necessarily focusing on security and data access and stuff like that, which, you know, I should probably just do by default in those videos. And then it goes on to say here that this forces you to have to kind of audit your client files carefully to make sure that you're not doing sensitive like data access from your components and using proper security, which is why this is generally not kind of the recommended approach, is accessing things directly from your components. Now, it also goes on to say that you can use the server only directive at the top of your files, which ensures that that code is only executed on the server. And if you try to import that function into a client component, it's going to throw an error. We've done this in kind of previous tutorials to kind of show you how this works. And you can even see in their data access layer, they use server only here. So this is basically saying that if you try to use these functions in client code, it's going to throw an error. However, it doesn't use this here. So you might be able to, you know, use some of this in client components. But here it's explicitly saying these functions, this exported get profile DTO, should only be used in a server component. And then if you do need that data in a client component, well, you'll probably just pass it as props down to a client component. And then further down in this article, it kind of mentions an interesting point here that I think is often missed. And I think it's often missed due to kind of the terminology of server and client components. But here it mentions that server and client components, they are both render on the server to produce their HTML. Server components, or React server components, execute in a separate module though to client components to avoid accidentally exposing information between the two modules. Client components that render through server-side rendering should be considered at the same security policy of just browser client code. So even if you are server-side rendering client components, you should basically treat that as just like a client component in general that is rendered on the client. So it should not gain access to any privileged data or private APIs. Now, a couple more notes here regarding reading and writing. So in Next.js App Router, reading data from the database or API is implemented by rendering server component pages. The input to these pages are search params. And kind of here in this paragraph, it mentions that in your search params, you shouldn't use things like is admin or things that would give you access to data in your database. You should have like a data access layer or an application or a HTTP layer that says whether a user has credentials or not. So you shouldn't just use like a dynamic route here that's a server component and pass like an isAdmin equals true param to that route, and then just assume that that user is okay to access admin level data, as that can be abused by someone that is a little bit clever and understands how to use URLs and query parameters and stuff like that. It might allow them to access sensitive data even when they're not the kind of appropriate user that should be able to do that. So here it says that for data access stuff and like read access controls and stuff like that, you should not just pass them as props or as params. You should always kind of re-verify that that user is who they say they are, they're authenticated, and they can access the data they want to access with the kind of data access layer or a HTTP layers, one of those methods that we discussed earlier. And then here it says, rendering a server component should also never perform side effects like mutations. So for example, in your server components, you shouldn't pass like a prop that says like log out equals true, or it shouldn't be like, log out equals true in a search param here. And then when that renders, it logs them out because it recognizes that search param. You should instead use something like a server action here in which, they click a logout button and that logs them out, rather than they click a logout button and that sets a search param. And then when your component re-renders, it recognizes that search param is true and it logs them out. It's much better to do that with something like a server action. And then for writes here, it mentions the idiomatic way. I think they're being a little bit fancy writing this. How just said, like, I think what they're saying is like the more appropriate way. I think that's kind of what idiomatic means, or at least what it means in this context. But the more appropriate way to do writes or mutations is using server actions. It says the use server annotation exposes an endpoint that makes all exported functions invocable by the client. I've covered server actions in future videos, or in previous videos. So hopefully you've maybe checked those out. If you haven't, go check those out where I cover those in more depth, but it says it can be invoked by the clients. As a result, those functions should always start by validating that the current user is allowed to invoke this action. So in this server action here, so it's in an actions file and it uses the use server directive at the top of the file, telling you that this is a server action. For this delete post server action, it checks the integrity of the arguments and it also validates the current user. So here it checks this ID argument. Here it just does it manually to where if it's not a number, it automatically throws an error. It says here you can use a tool like Zod. I'm not really familiar with that tool, but I'm guessing it just does something similar, but does some of this kind of abstracted out and does it under the hood. But here it gets the current user, checks if they can delete the post using that data access layer. And if it can't, it throws an error. But if they can, then it will delete this. So in your server actions, still ensuring to perform these different checks is still a good practice to do for security reasons. And then a final couple of things I want to touch on from this article is that for error handling, it mentions that in production mode, React doesn't emit errors or rejected promises to the client. Instead, a hash is sent representing the error. This hash can also be used to associate multiple of the same errors together and associate the error with server logs. React replaces the error messages with its own generic one. In development mode, server errors are still sent in plain text to the client. So it mentions here that it's important to always run in Next.js in production mode for production workloads. Development mode does not optimize for security and performance. So a couple of considerations when you're considering the UX of your application in production mode. Error handling is a little bit different when your application is running in prod versus dev. So just be aware of that when building your applications. And then when it comes to custom routes and middleware, one thing I wanted to touch on here is that middleware, it can be used to limit access to certain pages like we've done with protected routes in the past, basically saying that if there's not an authenticated user, they can't access this page. You could take this further to where a certain user could have certain permissions, like only an admin user can access this page. But the point that I want to mention here is that it's usually best to do this with an allow list rather than a deny list, because it's tricky to know all the different ways there is to get access to data, such as if there's a rewrite or a client request. So what it's basically saying here is that to limit access to certain pages, it's usually best to just allow users with certain credentials or certain permissions rather than trying to deny users without those credentials, because it can get a little bit tricky to know all the different ways that there are to access that data. So it's better to just write the permissions of who is allowed to access that data rather than saying who is not allowed. That's usually a bit better way to think about that. I think that's totally true. I've mistakenly tried to use did I lists in the past, and it just always ends up being more complex than it needs to be. So yeah, these are some considerations with security in Next.js. I would recommend reading through this entire article. But yeah, I hope that helps. I think this definitely gave me some things to consider, and I hope it gave you some things to consider as well. So thanks for tuning into this. I hope you learned something from this video, and I'll see you in the next one.